Today we are going to talk about the Kabbalah, which, short definition, Jewish mysticism or received tradition. Kabbalah is something that is fairly foundational as part of contemporary Western magic, and it's something that we encounter a lot, and we encounter a lot of things that are related to it. But there's been many versions and variants of it over time. Some of them go more in depth with certain things, some go more in depth with others. And what I want to do today is kind of look a little bit at a few Kabbalistic ideas, a little bit of the history of it as well, and look at how those things can kind of feed into and inform what we do in contemporary Western magic. So a little bit on my background with the Kabbalah. First started looking into it as a teenager, looking at kind of New Age Kabbalah resources, or for that sort, I guess, Kabbalah resources. And then looked a little bit more at stuff coming out of Golden Dawn and Golden Dawn inspired sources. Then when I got to college, I took a course in Jewish mysticism that was being taught by a rabbi whose PhD focus was in Jewish mysticism. And over the years following that course, continued to correspond with him on things that I had questions about or things that I wanted to learn. At the end of college, I joined an organization called the Order of the Celestial Academy, which was founded by former Golden Dawn members who were primarily Orthodox Jews who were trying to take a Golden Dawn approach to magic, but go back to more original Greek sources and more original Jewish Kabbalah sources and more traditional Renaissance sources for the alchemy. And so a lot of my background with Kabbalistic thinking is very influenced by Jewish Kabbalah. A lot of my practice with Kabbalah is influenced more by the Hermetic Kabbalah, because Hermetic Kabbalah is a little bit more accessible for practices, for correspondences. Jewish Kabbalah, however, tends to go a little bit deeper in terms of ideas and analysis. But a lot of those ideas and analysis are very much based on analyzing the Torah. And so if that's not necessarily what you're interested in, it may not be as useful for you. But I think when you look at the ways in which they approach that analysis and the ideas they use for it, a lot of them can be brought in as comparisons or as approaches in which we can take a Kabbalistic mindset when looking at other elements of contemporary magic and occultism and mysticism and initiation. So to go a little bit deeper into what the Kabbalah is, again, it's received tradition, it's the mystical system associated with Judaism, but it's not the only mystical system associated with Judaism. A lot of people, particularly from a contemporary perspective, tend to think of Kabbalah as encompassing all Jewish mysticism, which is pretty erroneous. There were several systems of mysticism in Judaism before the Kabbalah, even some practical systems of mysticism. The Kabbalah didn't really come into play until around, I think, the 12th or 13th century. And even as that was developing, it developed in a particular region, and there were still other mystical practices amongst the Jews in other regions. The earliest practical form of mysticism we find in Judaism is the mysticism of the Merkabah, or the Chehalot system. Merkabah is the chariot or the throne, and Chehalot is palaces. And so when we look at the apocryphal Jewish literature, we see a lot of stories that involve prophets and sages, and just for the distinction between the two, it has to do with what period in which a person is acting and what their access to visionary experience is. So the prophets are sort of a particular period of people where they got communication from God in order to benefit and explain things to the Jewish people. You had the judges as people who had a little bit less access and then were able to kind of guide from a legal perspective on the basis of the knowledge from the prophets. And then the sages are sort of like saints. They are early rabbinical teachers and scholars. Some of them had miraculous stories associated with them, but a lot of them are people who laid the foundational work for the Talmud and for the Mishnah. So they kind of developed the tradition of interpretation and the tradition of folklore that became these various mystical systems and ultimately led to the structure in which the early Kabbalistic texts were written. So the Merkabah, that was, again, the first system that we can say that we know there was a practical component to. Some people suggest that we can look at the Essenes and see a practical system there, but there's not much that's documented or left over from that for us to say for sure, or for us to say even specifically what their mystical system and ideas were, because most of what we have from them is fragmentary. With the Merkabah system, we can look at a period of apocryphal writing, largely which is based on interpreting the vision of the throne of God in the first chapter of Ezekiel and the vision of the throne of God in the book of Isaiah. Christians also have an additional vision of the throne of God in the Revelation, but that one doesn't really play into the development of the Jewish literature. From there, we see stories of actually patriarchs as well as the prophets and sages traveling through the heavens and gaining additional visions and understanding more about the structure of the cosmos. One of the key figures for this is Enoch, who was one of the ancestors of Noah. And in the Bible, he is referenced as having walked with God and then he was no more. The idea there is that if someone were to see the totality of the divine without any filter, they would no longer be able to be a human anymore. And so they couldn't continue functioning within the world. There's no real further explanation in the Bible as far as what happens to Enoch, but there are 3 books that are titled for him, really 2. The third one was titled as a Book of Enoch by a Christian scholar, and it does deal with Enoch becoming the Metatron, but it's not titled as a Book of Enoch in the actual text. But there's the Slavonic Book of Enoch, the Ethiopic Book of Enoch, and then the Sefer Heholot, the Book of the Palaces, which is considered the Hebrew Book of Enoch in modern scriptural studies. These books tell the story of how Enoch rose through the series of heavens and eventually entered into the throne room of God, saw the vision of the chariot, and ultimately became the Metatron, or the greatest of all angels. He's sort of the little Yahweh, or the little throne. He's described as appearing very much like God is described as appearing in the mystical literature. And he's often viewed as kind of a model for what the mystic does in exploring the heavens and achieving the vision of the throne. There's also texts that have Abraham doing this and other figures as well. In Sefer Heholot, Rabbi Ishmael does it as one of the important sages of the Talmudic period. This particular mystical system was sometimes criticized as being a Jewish form of Gnosticism, because there was the element that you had God and you had Metatron, and so you now had a heaven that had 2 powers in it. However, unlike in a Gnostic structure, there's not a any sort of adversarial divide between these two powers. The one power is essentially the viceroy of the other power. But it also has a kind of aeonic progression similar to Gnosticism, in which you have the space where God is, and then from that space you have a series of heavens through which creation occurs, and in which different types of divine activity are happening until you actually get to Earth itself. And so for that reason, some elements of Judaism at the time criticized it, as well as criticized it later. But like many forms of mysticism, eventually elements of it worked its way into the more mainstream religion, and the interpretation of the vision of the throne became important for other things that developed in Judaism later, and we will see that some elements of this also became important for the development of the Kabbalah. From this time, we have a handful of magical texts that survive. The dating on these texts is argued a little bit. So you'll see some people who say that they were really a little bit after this period where the Merkabah was the major system of mysticism. Others will say that they were solidly during the period, but they definitely contain elements that reference it. The Testament of Solomon is probably one of the particularly important ones, as it is the earliest text in the Solomonic cycle of texts. So when we look at the history of the magic of the grimoires, the Testament of Solomon is one of the earliest Liber Spiritums that we have, or books of spirits. It essentially describes a story in which the son of the foreman involved in building the temple is being harassed by a spirit at night, and is weak and sickly as a result. The foreman goes to Solomon, knowing that Solomon is wise and will be able to figure out what to do. And so Solomon prays to God, and the archangel Michael comes before him and gives him a magical ring and causes divine grace to descend upon him and grant him wisdom so that he's able to command the evil spirits. Solomon then brings the boy before him and uses the boy to call forth Ornias, the demon who has been vexing him. And Solomon questions him about his nature and then commands him to go forth and retrieve the next demon in succession. And he runs through all of the various demons this way, and their natures are recorded in the Testament along with this story of how he conjured them. Some of the demons describe their position amongst the seven heavens before the fall, and that's the element that kind of ties back into the Merkabah structure. Also from this time we have the Harbe de Moshe, or the Sword of Moses, which describes a series of divine names to be used for calling upon the angels. One interesting element of interpreting that text is that it gives a position in which the angels serve because magic, being within the purview of creation, is therefore within the purview of God, and so God becomes the god of magic and desires for humans to engage in magic in order to become closer to him and to participate with him in creation. At least that's an interpretation that Yuval, I'm not sure how to say his name, but he wrote the popular book Sapiens, which is out. He also did this modern translation of Sword of Moses. And so it's a position that's fairly different than most places where we look and see ideas about how conjuration of spirits works in a Judeo-Christian structure. One of the other remaining magical texts that's important from that period is Sefer HaRetzim, or the Book of Secrets, which feeds into the later Ratziel tradition of grimoires. The book essentially describes the nature of the seven heavens and what cohorts of angels exist within those heavens and their various powers. It also gives rituals that look kind of like folk magic, or what's sometimes referred to as mixed Kabbalah, in order to utilize those angels to accomplish various things. And so all of these texts sort of set up things that feed into later magical systems, just as the apocryphal texts of the Merkabah and the texts that are more related to working with the various angelic princes and traveling through the heavens set up things that feed into the later Kabbalah system. Also around this time, and this is pretty much right after the destruction of the temple and the expulsion of the Jews from Israel, is the work of creation, or the Maaseh Bereshit. From that, we get the Sefer Yetzirah, which is a text that many people familiar with contemporary Kabbalah will have heard of, if not read. That text is often thought of as one of the foundational texts of the Kabbalah, but it itself is actually from an earlier textual tradition. I recall right, the text claims to be written by Adam. Ironically, it's from about the time when Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was around and could possibly have been associated with the rabbinical school that he was part of. And he's the rabbi that later on the Zohar was attributed to, even though it was written centuries later. The work of creation can kind of serve as a foundation for practical magic, but we don't really have any evidence that there was a practical work that went with the work of creation. The rabbi that taught the course that I took said regarding the Sefer Yetzirah that anyone who says that they fully understand it is lying, because if they did, they could create humans. That's basically what the book tells you to do. Not through the normal process. And you did, and maybe there were some Kabbalistic things happening there. But the Sefer Yetzirah, in terms of being foundational for the Kabbalah, gives us the initial idea that there are 10 Sefirot. It doesn't say what a Sephirah is, or what they do, or how they're arranged. It just says there's 10 of them, not 9, not 11. It also sets up a lot of ideas that become the foundation for later letter mysticism systems. The important idea of the work of creation is essentially that man is a participant in creation. Creation is not something that is fully the purview of God. Creation is something that every day humanity participates in and is part of. So that, again, will become important for some of the elements of the Kabbalah that we'll talk about as well. The final kind of early mysticism approach in Judaism was the Shir Koma, which was study and reflection on the measurements of the body of God and sort of measuring and mapping the heavens. One of the texts that's associated with the Merkabah, the vision of Ezekiel, is primarily just talking about different lengths that each heaven is and how far you have to travel within heaven before you reach the next heaven. And so that text really falls more within the Shir Koma. I think part of the idea behind this system was an attempt to comprehend the incomprehensible. So kind of a very fundamental mystical practice of reflecting on those things that are completely immeasurable, those things that we can't understand through a normal rational process, things that we can't hold on to in a traditional physical sense and understand them that way, and attempting to view them from a perspective that would allow us to understand them in an almost physical sense, so that we can kind of break out of that basic physical sense by reflecting on vastness and on the immensity of those things that are beyond. Again, a lot of the elements of these systems form the foundation of a lot of Kabbalistic thinking. The work of creation foreshadows the tree of life. A lot of the purpose of the tree of life is understanding the process of creation, understanding the way in which God unfolds in order to create everything which exists, and how the divine is therefore part of everything that exists based on this process of unfolding. The idea of moving up and down the tree and path working. Honestly, I can't say whether or not there is a good traditional basis for path working in Judaic Kabbalah. There's a lot of Jewish practices of meditation for engaging the tree, but I don't think that they look precisely like what pathworking looks like in the Golden Dawn and the Thelemic systems. But when we look at some of the writings about the Merkabah that occur a few hundred years after it was majorly a mystical system, they talk about reflecting and looking within one's own heart and moving through your heart in order to experience the heavens. And so there's very clearly an idea that the ascent through the heavens is meant to be not exactly metaphorical, but something that occurs in a spiritual sense that we experience through our mental faculties rather than our physical bodies being taken into it. And so, again, we have something that's sort of a foundation for this work that we associate with the Tree of Life. There's also a kind of Neoplatonic theurgical element to both the Merkabah work and the Kabbalah. And when we look at them historically, the time that the Merkabah was developing was during the same time that Neoplatonism was a developing or major spiritual tradition that was within the whole confluence of Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, early Christianity, Judaism, all moving through the Mediterranean, feeding into each other, adjusting each other, informing each other, and sort of each adding parts that helped create each different system and each different view on these particular groups of mysteries. When we get to the development of the Kabbalah, that's also where we're starting to see the influx of Greek knowledge coming back into Europe through the interactions with the Arabic world. And so it makes sense that we again see these Neoplatonic elements there. The clearest element in the Kabbalah is probably, aside from the whole idea of creation being a discursive process going from a single point to a series of divisions further and further out, which is pretty much what happens in the Tree of Life. There's also the division of the tree into sections that match up fairly similarly to the various worlds of intellect and understanding and a Neoplatonic structure. And in Neoplatonism, as you move through these worlds of the physical world, the intellectual spiritual world, the spiritual world, you gain different virtues in your personhood, but you also gain access to different spirits and the powers associated with those spirits, and are able to work magic through working with those spirits and those divinities at that different level. And the magic that you're working helps propel you through to further levels. In the Merkabah, as you move through the heavens, you gained secret signs and passwords and names of angels and songs that were used in order to help progress you through the heavens, but then they could also be used for magical purposes to call upon those angels and to initiate their influence in the world and control the things that those angels ruled over. In the Kabbalah, we see that same idea that as you're moving through, working with the different virtues of the trees, of the spheres, working with the angels and the conceptions of God in the spheres, that impacts yourself, impacts your understanding of the world, the way in which you see things around you, the way in which you understand yourself and your place in the world. And as you gain in those understandings, that helps you move back through that unfolding of creation and come back closer to the origin point. Additionally, you gain access to the different powers and spirits that are associated with those spheres, and then can use those again in practical magic as well. There's also, in looking at a comparison to the Shir Koma, the idea of describing God and creation allows you to describe how God and creation are similar and how the two interact with each other, and how when there is some change or movement in God, it's reflected in creation. When there's a change in movement in creation, it can be reflected back in God. That the divine energy that feeds into creation and brings life and movement into the world can be directed and moved based on how creation interacts with the world of the divine. This becomes a major element in the practical Kabbalah and the idea of taking different correspondences and building rituals out of those correspondences, or building talismans out of different divine names, or different sigils drawn based on the tree or based on different divine words. It's also something that we see reflected in Hermetic ideology with the idea of as above, so below, and so below, as above, that that which is created in one space is a reflection of that which is created in another space, and that the two spaces interact together in order to create a singular space that expresses the totality of being. As we move out of the early historical phases of mysticism and Judaism and into the diaspora, the Ashkenazic Jews had their own mystical systems that retained elements primarily of the Merkabah and the Shir Koma. This is where we start seeing the Ratziel grimoires, like Sefer Ratziel Hamalak, or the Book of the Angel Ratziel, the Angel of Secrets. A lot of the content of the Sefer HaRatzim is copied into that text, but then there are other things that start looking more foundational, like the other grimoires that we see later outside of the Jewish tradition. That textual tradition also feeds into the Heptameron, which is one of the foundational texts of the Solomonic system, and sort of bridges the gap between the Ratziel grimoires and the Solomonic grimoires. If there's anything that I talk about that is unfamiliar for people, because I'm kind of running all along the lines of like people are generally going to be familiar with the various historical grimoires and elements of contemporary magic, feel free to just like flag me and like ask questions if I need to explain things further. I should have said that in the beginning instead of saying it in the middle. And another text that may be influenced by the Ashkenazic mysticism is the Book of Abramelin. Now, that is one that is going to be fairly famous and well known for people that are interested in Thelema. And
what is that?
The Book of Abramelin alleges to be the life story of Abraham the Jew and his trip to Egypt to learn all the greatest secrets of magic, where he finds the mystic Abramelin, who teaches him the sacred magic. Now, a lot of times people interpret the sacred magic as being a ritual in order to achieve knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel. The sacred magic is actually a system of working with spirits based on working with the Holy Guardian Angel, and then through the facility of the Holy Guardian Angel, conjuring the kings and dukes of the demonic world and binding them to service and to responding to a series of magical talismans in the form of letter squares.
That sounds like a lot of work. Who would do such a thing?
Awesome people would do such a thing. So
you invited questions.
Yes, yeah, questions are good. What's significant about the Abramelin is it presents a medieval system of work with demons that intentionally separates itself from the Solomonic and the Faustian traditions of working through drawing complex circle patterns on the floor, going through a series of lengthy prayers with very specifically put together tools, and then making threats to the spirits and attempting to bind them by divine names, which is what we see in most of the Grimoire tradition. Abramelin is like, why the heck are you going to do that? That is superstitious nonsense and is probably evil. What you should do is pray a whole bunch for like 18 months, and then this really awesome angel is going to show up, and it's going to teach you everything, and it's going to be your friend and guide, and it's going to introduce you to some good spirits, and then it's going to show you how to call upon all these other evil spirits and how to bind them. And then whenever you feel like it, you pick up one of those letter squares that you've bound the spirits to, move it around in some way that's associated with the square, and then the demon will go do the thing it's supposed to go do.
That doesn't sound any less complicated.
Once you finish it, it's super easy. It makes spirit magic so much easier.
Did you get it to work?
Yeah, it's the whole 18-month thing. The French manuscript says 6 months. Crowley recommends, I think, 11 weeks. I think a lot of it depends on what other work you've been doing leading up to it.
Modern magicians, 2 days.
The text doesn't really spell out too much in terms of specifics on what you do during that time frame. So it sounds pretty intense and pretty crazy, but it's mostly you cut out some things that are problematic in your life. You add some time to your day to focus on prayer and meditation. So you have a handful of times a day where you're praying and reflecting. You're reducing some elements of your social activity, business activity, cutting out things that are going to be unhealthy or bad for yourself. And
stuff you're supposed to do to have a spiritual life.
right. And then over the course of the time that you're doing it, the amount of time that you spend praying and reflecting each day gets longer and longer. So like at the beginning, it might be 5 to 10 minutes, like 4 times a day, whereas towards the end, it might be an hour, hour and a half, 4 times a day. And then when you're in the final phase of the ritual, it's just hours and hours of going through doing prayers. But it's totally worth it. The experience is one of the most awesome and unquestionable experiences in magic. And then if you go through with properly binding the spirits afterwards, they are very effective in working the squares that are included in the book.
What do they do? What do these spirits do?
It's a lot of the stuff that's very traditional in grimoires, like these spirits will help you gain the favor of a king or a lord. This square will help you achieve the love of a particular maiden. This square will help you achieve the love of a maiden in general. This one will make a magical feast appear. Or this one makes an army appear. Have not tried making feasts or armies appear. I don't know how those work.
Why don't you just call stuff, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right?
I mean, you're better.
Which one makes the judge throw out your speeding ticket?
That I would use Merkabah work for, and there's a whole write-up on my blog about how to do it. There's ones for weather. There's ones for destroying cities. So it's a lot of the stuff that you typically would see in a grimoire, but without all of the rigmarole of conjuration.
No, just 18 months of prayer ahead of time.
Good question.
I don't want to get you too far away from the material. You're talking about the book of Abraham Mage. How do I word this to you guys? Is that the sole way that you all operate to contact the Holy Guardian Angel, or do you all?
No, there's
There's
other
no one way.
ways. There's a lot of argument about whether or not all of the kind of personal daemon or spiritual assistant rituals through history are the same thing. There's good evidence that a lot of them are. So there's, in the Greek magical papyri, there are methods for achieving a spiritual assistant involving killing a hawk and standing on a roof. But there's a second method in like the very next papyrus fragment that is not as complicated. But there's a lot of what's described there makes it sound like, probably the same idea, like in an earlier version of the idea of what shows up in Abramelin. In the Merkabah system, typically it starts out with the Prince of the Presence, which is an angelic prince that shows up and is a vision for the mystic in lieu of a vision of God directly, appears and teaches the mystic to rise through the heavens and work with the angels. So again, it's a very similar concept. We had a guest lecturer here presenting on Enochian magic about a year or two ago, and he pointed out that there is in the received Enochian material instructions for a ritual for cloistering oneself and receiving an angel, and then that angel helps you with doing the rest of the system. So it's a very traditional part of magic in a lot of systems, and it's one that I think modern magic kind of glossed over a little bit.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like within
the OTO, there's
Find two elements that do things the same.
You're doing real well.
There's the OTO.
I was wondering if that's the soul.
No.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, no. It's so the OTO basically gives you a series of experiences that reflect on ways to live and experience life, and you can draw different mystical interpretations and magical interpretations from those initiation experiences. And there's a point in the OTO system that could help with encouraging achieving knowledge and conversation, but it is not something that is necessarily the focus of the OTO system, so we don't have a particular curriculum for doing so. The AA system has a point that that is the requirement of a particular grade, the Adeptus Minor. In traditional Jewish Kabbalah, the sphere of Tiferet is a twofold sphere. It has an internal portion and an external portion. In the AA system, the grade of 5 equals 6, which is the grade associated with Tiferet, is a twofold grade. It has an internal and an external portion. The external portion of that grade, you are seeking knowledge and conversation of your holy guardian angel. The internal portion, you have received knowledge and conversation of your holy guardian angel. The AA system, people frequently think of Liber Samekh as being the AA's method for achieving knowledge and conversation. It's actually Liber 8, which is based on Chapter 8 of the Vision and the Voice, and it describes an 11-week version of the Abramelin, where Crowley outlines essentially the ritual set up for the temple and implies ritual practices, but they're left to your interpretation. But within the OTO, you'll see some people who work towards that aim, and some people use Abramelin, some people use the PGM, some people use the Crowley material. There's all sorts of different ways, and I think as long as you get to that end, then it's more that than like which method you go with. But it's not something where there's a point where somebody's going to say, you have to take 18 months and lock yourself in a room and don't come out till you meet this angel, otherwise you're not in the OTO anymore. Like, it's the OTO we're a social fraternal organization, so it's not something where you've got to do this one thing. So the tie-in for the Abramelin with the Ashkenazic mysticism is that most of the Ashkenazic mysticism developed in the areas that we now occupy, sort of Germany, Austria, that part of the world, and that is where the Abramelin texts come from. They come from the same period. They most likely were written by a rabbi who was engaged in magical and mystical practice, and so he would have been working out of that Ashkenazic mystical system. And again, it doesn't look like the Christian grimoires that are based on Catholicism and Catholic liturgy. It's basically you pray a lot, God sends an angel, you use a very limited group of divine names after that, and then that angel helps you work with spirits. So it looks a lot more like what happens in Jewish magical tradition. The other part of Ashkenazic mysticism, which is going to be very popular for a lot of OTO and Thelema people, Chris knows what's coming, is letter mysticism. I hate letter mysticism. But letter mysticism is what most people think of when they say Kabbalah in a modern context. Gematria. In the Golden Dawn, they described letter mysticism as literal Kabbalah. And it basically has to do with ways of looking at relationships and permutations of words and sentences for the purpose of mystical reflection. You can also use it for practical purposes with determining what divine or occult forces are associated with a particular word, and then applying that word in ritual or applying that word in a talisman, or further understanding a divine name or the name of a spirit based on its correspondences and value. The essential idea that's inherent in it is that Hebrew is based on the language of the angels, which is based on the language that God used to create the universe, because the universe, as is described in the Sefer Yetzirah, is made by boundaries, and those boundaries are letters and numbers. In Genesis, obviously the universe is created by God speaking, and so therefore again it's letters and numbers that are making the universe. So those letters and numbers have particular values or vibrations or qualities to them, and those other words that have similar values and vibrations and qualities are therefore tied in nature on a divine level, even if they're not concepts that we would necessarily look at as associated at first glance looking at the words. So you have systems like Gematria for looking at the numerical value of words and making comparisons there. Notarian, where you compress sentences into words and expand words into sentences. And then Tamora, which has to do with ways of making word and letter substitutions. And so that actually developed as part of the mysticism that the Ashkenazi Jews were engaged in a whole different part of Europe, slightly before the Kabbalah. Now the Kabbalah itself, that is what most people think of when they think of Jewish mysticism. It is easily the prevailing form of Jewish mysticism. It kind of absorbed parts of all the other historical forms, and it won. It's the one that won the competition for being the one that people pay attention to. It also became the form of Jewish mysticism that grabbed the minds of non-Jews and of Christians, and then eventually of magicians. When we look at modern magic, so I wanted to have a quote from Garden of Pomegranates here, but apparently we don't have a copy, and I couldn't find my copy at home. But I really wanted to insult Israel Regardi. So now I'm not going to be able to do that as easily. I should have thought of that. But Israel Regardi, in the opening Garden of Pomegranates, which is kind of one of the foundational texts for a lot of modern Kabbalah. He's drawing on works written by other Golden Dawn magicians before him, but he's kind of the filter. He's like the lens that the Golden Dawn was sort of shined through in order to, or like prism that divided out the Golden Dawn system amongst all of modern magic and neo-paganism. And in Garden of Pomegranates, he literally describes the Kabbalah as a filing cabinet. That it is a way that you can say, all right, here's all the things that have to do with this sphere, and this sphere is associated with the color red, and so everything associated with the color red can be tied to this sphere, and this letter is associated with this path, and so all these things associated with this letter go with this path, and so they all relate in some way and are relatively interchangeable from a magical perspective. And when we look at like 777, Crowley's Book of Correspondences, that's pretty much what 777 does, is it creates a filing cabinet system for different correspondences. We have a series of columns and a series of tables, and everything on them is linked back to a particular portion of the Tree of Life. And so if we want to engage that portion of the Tree of Life, then we say, okay, row number 8, we're going to look in all these different columns for things that connect to row number 8, and whichever ones we've got around, we can pull those out and we can put them together in a ritual, and that's going to let us draw on the forces and ideas associated with row number 8. It's not precisely how the Kabbalah works in traditional Kabbalah. In the traditional Kabbalah, it's an explanation of the Torah and a fulfillment of Jewish scripture. So there's a lot of really weird laws and rules and really weird rituals that had no explanation, where it's just like, God said you should do this thing, and because he said it, we're going to do it, and maybe we'll come up with some like legalistic explanation based on other elements of the law, but who knows why God said to really do this. So Moses de Leon eventually published a book called the Zohar, or the Book of Splendor. And the Zohar purported to be written by Shimon Bar Yochai, rabbi from like 1st century or something like that, but it wasn't. After Moses de Leon's death, someone offered to, I think, marry their son off to his daughter and pay a bunch of money in exchange for being able to see the original manuscripts that de Leon translated in order to publish the Zohar. And his wife was like, there are no manuscripts. He made the whole thing up. So there was a lot of debate over the centuries as to whether or not he wrote it or to whether or not he really had an ancient manuscript. His wife said he wrote it. But it is possible that he didn't write it by himself. There may have been additional authors involved in writing it. It is a massive text, which in order for him to write it, he would have had to have an immense understanding of all the elements of Jewish law and interpretation, and be able to tie all sorts of little details together in order to explain how the mystical nature of creation explains why, if an egg of a particular type of bird falls out of a nest, you should cook that egg and eat it, and then life will be good. All sorts of strange rules that, again, you look at them and it's like, what the heck does this have to do with the world around me? The Zohar explains. The Zohar gives a foundational basis for how, based on the workings of the cosmos and the workings of God, these different things in the laws correspond to each other, and therefore they become these spiritual rituals that by engaging in them, you make the world a better place. The Zohar is not, however, the first Kabbalistic text. The Sefer HaBahir is the first text that we can say is definitively a Kabbalistic text. So the Kabbalah did predate Moses de Leon by a little bit, and most likely the Bahir is a reflection of teachings of a group of rabbis that were working together and developing the Kabbalah based on elements of Jewish tradition as well as elements of Christian and Neoplatonic mysticism that were all sort of melting together around Spain at the time. Later on, there's a major development in the Kabbalah with Rabbi Isaac Luria, who was possibly the Messiah of his age, but died young of sickness. He claims because his students wrote down his teachings when they weren't supposed to, and so he was not able to be the Messiah and therefore had to die. A lot of what Luria taught was recorded by 2 of his students, and their books kind of spread out and normalized a lot of his teachings, a lot of his Kabbalistic ideas into the rest of Judaism. So like in contemporary magic, when we talk about how the Shekinah is the equivalent of the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is the Sophia, and so in Christianity, the Sophia is the female aspect of the Trinity, and in Judaism, the Shekinah is God's bride, and that certain elements of the Sabbath have to do with the the mystical marital union of the Shekhinah and God, that is mostly coming from Luria. That's a Kabbalistic idea that came from the rabbis associated with him and his time period. We see the Shekhinah referenced earlier in Jewish scripture, but it's never personified in the same way or treated as God's bride up until that point.
And that connects with Sophia?
Basically the idea that Luria took for the Shekhinah is almost equivalent to the idea of the Sophia in Gnosticism and Orthodox Christianity. That it's a female expression of grace and wisdom that transmits forth from God into the world for mankind to experience. Before and during the time of Luria, there was also Christian Kabbalah that was getting started. And so when we think of the Kabbalah and we think of Hermetic Kabbalah, a lot of that is really drawing on the Christian Kabbalah that was developing in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, or more the Renaissance. In particular, Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, he was very familiar with the teachings of Reuchlin, and in Book 2 of 3 books of occult philosophy, we have a series of tables that just lay out correspondences for things. And so I can't fully blame the filing cabinet idea on Regardie. Yes?
So you said Agrippa made the Christian Kabbalah.
Well, he was he expounded it. So he wasn't the first person to do it, but he drew on other Christian Kabbalah sources.
When was it, and is he the one who's on the portico of the Pantheon and says some Agrippa person built it in Latin?
No. Agrippa was a name that was one of the major families in Rome also. But Agrippa would have been 15th century in Germany, I think. And so,
15th century.
yeah.
And it was very typical for writers at that time to take a Latin name because most writing was still done in Latin, and even in the century when it stopped being done in Latin. So it wasn't a pseudonym. It was something that you did. Basically, it was like your college name. Mm-hmm. And Agrippa was his Latin.
Yeah, he would have otherwise been Heinrich von Nettesheim. Yeah, and so, but the second book of the 3 books of occult philosophy, which more or less is one of the most important books of Western magic, is primarily a series of tables of correspondences that are drawn from Christian Kabbalah, and then also along with that, series of correspondences for zodiacal magic. The magical calendar is another text from around the same time that presents similar tables, as well as the text by Dr. Rudd, which has been published as a treatise on angel magic by Adam McLean, and then also published as Keys to the Gateway of Magic by Skinner and Rankin. So even before the Golden Dawn and before Mathers and Crowley and Regardie, we see this idea of, okay, we can kind of strip down all these ideas and just say, all right, these things all sort of relate to each other. We can build these tables to understand how they relate. And so the way that Agrippa sets it up, you have a series of divine names of different numbers of letters. And so each table is numbered based on that divine name, and then each letter is given a series of correspondences that expand out as you get more and more letters in the names. Which is actually the same structure the magical calendar uses. It's probably based on Agrippa. The Golden Dawn then kind of comes out of this structure. And so the Golden Dawn, as much as I probably sound a little negative towards them and their approach to the Kabbalah, was really a brilliant development for its time. They took the sort of Masonic lodge magic that had been occurring in Europe already, and they decided that it needed to be developed into a full system that encompassed the entirety of Western knowledge of magic and mysticism. And so they used the Kabbalah as the glue for doing that. But in their approach to using the Kabbalah to glue it all together, again, they just sort of took that filing cabinet approach that we see in some elements of Christian Kabbalah, as opposed to taking an overall philosophical approach to it that we see in the Jewish Kabbalah. And so, as mentioned, the Golden Dawn had a way of dividing the Kabbalah out with dogmatic Kabbalah, literal Kabbalah, and practical Kabbalah. Dogmatic Kabbalah is what we're going to get into in just a minute, which has to do with the way in which we understand the universe and the way that the Kabbalah explains the universe to us. Literal Kabbalah is the letter mysticism that we talked about before, and then practical Kabbalah is the idea of taking those various correspondences and building rituals in order to connect to particular divine forces or to influence the world around us. Pathworking, more or less, yeah, would fall in relation to, or at least tangent to, practical Kabbalah. Yes.
I read this book on the Masonic Kabbalah. It was pretty like the Golden Dawn. They described all the temples, which are the circles. What do they look like? And they're on the astral plane because people have been thinking about it for forever. And this is what they look like. And you visualize this. You're supposed to go there, go from one to the other. I never really could get it to work. How do you make it work?
A lot of that is very much based on particular groups develop particular structures and visualizations in order to help you get to those places. So it's almost that within your imagination, you want to build up the place that they describe and then try to embody the reality of that imagination to the point that you're able to connect to the space that it's describing. So it's less that if you go to the sphere of Gevurah, you're going to see this thing that they describe there, as much as if in your active imagination you build up this visualization that they've described, then that can be a link for you to use to pathwork to that spiritual space. In terms of practical pathworking, I would recommend in Israel Regardi's Golden Dawn the lecture on scrying and spirit vision, which I think is actually written by Florence Farr. And alternatively, Liber O by Crowley. That has a description of a method of pathworking that's pretty simple. Or Mysteria Magica by Denning and Phillips also has a very accessible pathworking method, and they actually have a whole book on pathworking as well. But rather than look at these different visualizations and visions that people have written down as far as this is what it's supposed to look like when you get there, those systems will work on how you can either use that kind of inner sight or use the transmission of your spiritual awareness along a ray of consciousness to another space, typically through a symbol or possibly not through a symbol, possibly through vibrating a name or some other reflection that connects to that sphere as a way of guiding you to the place you're going. And then from there you can kind of explore on your own and see what things you encounter and experience there. There was a test that was used in the AA for being able to pathwork the tree, where you were given a symbol or a link to a particular space, and you weren't told what it linked to, and then you had to scry or travel to that space spiritually, and then based on what you saw, then your initiator would look at whether or not the correspondences lined up. So not necessarily did you go and you see this particular temple vision that somebody has written out and described, because that's really their own thing. It's not what's actually there. But did you go there and did you see the element that's associated with that sphere? So you went to Chesed. Did you see water, or did you see fire or earth or air symbolism? Well, you saw water symbolism. Okay, so that means you're on track. What colors did you see? It's like, oh, I saw a lot of blues and some oranges countercharging the blues. It's like, okay, well then that sounds like you're on track. What kind of figures did you see? I saw a powerful king on a throne with a scepter. It's like, okay, that's very jovial. That very much fits with Hesed. But like if you go and you're like, I saw a lot of fire and little small frantic people taking things and putting them together so they all dissolved into the fire. It's like, okay, that's kind of a neat vision, but has nothing to do with Hesed, so you probably didn't get to the right space. So more what you want to look at is whether or not what you're seeing when you scry or when you astrally project to these places, does it fit with the overall nature of the space, as opposed to did you see a particular vision that someone else had or that some other group built up over time. Because usually for those visions that a group builds up, unless you're tied into that group's egregor and linked into the visionary cues that they have built into their system of initiation, you're probably not going to see the same thing they saw. General correspondences, those you probably will connect on though. As far as the pervasiveness of the Golden Dawn Kabbalah, most of modern Western magic kind of has that as a foundation, even if it doesn't like expressly say it does. So like if we look at chaos magic, which is very much like, no, we don't need all these traditional structures and we can take anything that we want and put it together and find how these things correspond to each other. It's almost precisely the filing cabinet idea. It's you're saying, okay, these characters from Alice in Wonderland can be associated with these different spiritual ideas, and so we can use them as symbols in this ritual. Okay, well, it's the same thing as the Golden Dawn Kabbalah. It's just you're not using traditional symbols. And then Wicca as another example of something that is fairly big and spread out. Their whole divine structure is Kabbalah and alchemy, and based on the way that it's treated in the Golden Dawn. Even a lot of the symbols that they use for it are basically structured along the ideas of the Tree of Life and along the Golden Dawn alchemical symbolism. And from their approach, that kind of spreads out to the rest of neo-paganism and a lot of modern magic that's not based on the American New Thought movement. So there's places where you're going to encounter modern Kabbalah all over the place if you're engaged in any sort of modern magic or any sort of neo-paganism. For traditional Kabbalah, and looking at Kabbalah based on ideas rather than based on correspondences, the first place to look is at creation. So we're going to look at two different ways of looking at the story of creation. The earlier, more medieval Kabbalistic structure is basically the story of creation that appears in Genesis. God takes a series of 6 days and describes what he wants to bring into existence. You can kind of associate those days with the primary archangels, but you don't necessarily have to. That's not necessarily a traditional idea. And as he's describing these things, they all come into being. And then he decides, okay, I've made this cool thing, and now someone needs to be here to take care of it. So he makes Adam, and then he's like, oh, Adam's going to be lonely. Let me make Eve. And they kind of chill in the garden and have this super cool paradise where they don't have to wear clothes and they get to talk to God whenever they want to. But God had one rule. Don't eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge. He told Adam. Adam told Eve. And then the serpent comes along and is like, hey, Eve, that fruit is pretty awesome. You should eat that awesome fruit. And Eve's like,
what's the best way to get a kid to do something that
tell him not to do it. So Eve's like, I don't know. I'll probably get in trouble. And the serpent's like, dude, no. I've been here longer than you. I know God better than you. He's a softie.
It's fine.
You're not going to get in trouble. He's going to be cool. He really wants you to eat the fruit because the fruit will make you more like him. And he's pretty awesome. You should be like him.
It's fine.
So Eve's like,
It's fine.
oh crap, that fruit's going to make me more like God? God's pretty cool. All right, there's no way he doesn't want me to actually eat the fruit. So Eve eats the fruit and she takes it to Adam and she's like, Adam, dude, this fruit, it tastes awesome and now I know shit. So you should eat this fruit too. And Adam's like, all right, you told me to eat it. You're here. You're pretty cool. I'll eat the fruit.
Adam was easier to convince.
He's got his woman coming up to him saying you should eat this. So obviously he's got to do it. So Adam eats the fruit and then suddenly they now have knowledge. And so God comes up and he's like, whoa, wait a minute. Something's different. This is not right. What is going on?
How'd you guys get smart?
Exactly.
It was easier to set up for God was unworthy of being God.
And he's like, you guys ate that fruit I told you not to, didn't you? And they're like, yeah, we did. And God's like, damn it, I really love you guys. I really do not want to punish you. I don't want to kill you like I said I was going to. And Eve is like, holy shit, Adam, you did not tell me that was the punishment. And God's like, well, all right, let's figure out a way around this. He's like, I said this would happen, so because what I say is what's true and what comes into being in the universe, I've got to punish you. You've got to die. But I don't really like that idea. So we're just going to kind of expel you from paradise, and you're going to live in the world, and eventually you'll die. And you'll have these other things that you'll have to struggle with along the way. So
Jerk face.
from a Kabbalistic perspective, God begins in a space where mercy or chesed and judgment and gevurah are equal and balanced in the universe. And because they're balanced, the universe is bathed in splendor and beauty, or tiferet. When God is forced to punish Adam, because he actually never told Eve anything. Eve's not really to blame. It's Adam's fault. Adam's the one that didn't listen to God.
Damn straight. Punished Eve, though, but we can talk about that later.
He did. That's sort of the weird, messed up part of it. He had to engage in judgment. He wanted mercy, because mercy is always what you should err on the side of if you're going to make a mistake. But he had to engage in judgment because his word was the law even for himself. He had to punish them. And so when that happens, Gevurah becomes the principal force at play in the universe at the time. And so when Gevurah swells up and becomes bigger and more effectual than Chesed, that kind of screws up the rest of the tree beneath it. They're imbalanced, they're not weighted the same, and so Tiferet is kind of skewed off to the side, which shakes apart Yesod, and Malchuth, the kingdom, falls off from it. Because initially, Malchuth and Yesod are sort of bound up together into union with each other, and that's what Eden is. When Malchuth falls away and is no longer in direct communication with the divine, the world is no longer paradise, the world is just the material world. And so that's essentially the Kabbalistic understanding of the fall of man. So the rest of human experience then is about finding space in order to create mercy in the universe. Finding space to limit judgment, limit sternness, limit evil, so that balance can be brought back between judgment and mercy, and the universe can mold itself back to its original form in which man exists in paradise. That's a weird word. And that's basically how a Kabbalistic way of looking at things works, is we look at a story, or we look at a rule or a ritual, or even just something that's happening in life, and we look at how does this play out on a divine level? What does this have to do with the way in which life and light are moving through the spheres of the tree of life? How does this reflect the tree being communicated into the world? And when we engage back into this thing that's occurring, how does that then communicate back to the tree, communicate back into the divine level of creation, what our intentions and our goals and our way of existing are, and how does that repair the world? How does that set the world back to the way it originally was and bring us closer back to paradise? When we try to tie this into modern magic, then the fall of man becomes an easy map for the need for the mysteries, or the need for systems of initiation and what initiation does. Initiation is essentially a process of rebalancing and restructuring man's understanding of the world, man's interaction with the world, and his understanding and interaction with himself, so that he comes back into a more perfected state, and is able to both internally experience that state of paradise, but also engage the world in such a way that through his own vision and understanding, through his own righteousness, he's able to set things back on the path towards mercy. In describing that, we kind of skipped over describing the tree itself, which, looking at how to set this up, was a weird thing to structure. But a basic description of the tree is that the tree is a process by which the divine constricts and expands in order to create a polarity and dynamism for a movement of a flow of divine light to enliven the world. And as the divine constricts and expands, it creates spaces where you have a particular divine nature in focus. And then there is another related but somewhat opposing divine nature in focus on the other side, which creates a position for light to flow between the two, and for the overall expression of the divine to flow throughout this progression from a more pure, complete space to a more individuated, manifest space. Yes.
So why exactly do we try to go to these temples?
So that's actually basically the whole process of this light moving through. The divine starts out as nothingness. There's no characteristic, there's no definition, there's no boundary. The divine limits itself into limitlessness. So now there's something substantive, but that substantive nature still has no boundary, no characteristic. That limitlessness becomes a limitless light, and so it becomes something that has quality to it. So we go from non-substantive to substantive of a particular characteristic, but that characteristic holds the potential for everything else within it. That light manifests itself through Keter, which is the first state of expansiveness, but it's sort of an ultimate expansiveness before the idea of contraction and expansion occurs. In Keter, you have limitless potential. You have the whirling nature of all of creation and everything that will ever be created, everything that will never be created, and everything that there's the potential to ever have exist. From Keter, you move into Chokmah, or wisdom, which is the first expansive state of God. And it's the idea that this light and this potential can be expressed forth into something that could come into being. But it's just an expression. It's not anything that manifests itself. The first contracting state is Binah, or wisdom, understanding. So wisdom is expressed, and then that wisdom is received and understood into something that's knowable. That passes through knowledge, and then from knowledge is divided into the rest of the tree, where you have mercy, judgment, splendor, victory, glory, foundation, and the kingdom. The idea there is that as it's moving through these different expansions and contractions, God is refining down to more specific, understandable, knowable, experienceable pieces. So instead of being something that's a totality, it's something that's been divided out as it considers and reconsiders itself through all of these different positions, so that it becomes these finite individuated pieces that are able to interact with each other, and then it can know itself through all of these finite individuated pieces. And this idea is basically identical to Neoplatonism. From our perspective, we start out at the bottom. We start out where we are these finite individuated pieces that know each other. Like, we gain knowledge of what it's like to experience the table, the floor, the air, the people around us, the various emotions and experiences of life. And we grow and change and are shaped by those things, but we're still an individual piece of creation, even though we bring into ourselves all of these other parts. So moving back up through the tree is a way that we can expand our understanding of the things we're experiencing by gaining a broader and broader perspective on existence. It's a way that we can gain a deeper knowledge and understanding of the different powers that create the things that we experience in life. And we can gain an advantage by having a greater link and access to those powers, so that we can influence the things we experience in life that are related back to those powers. At least within the lower 7 spheres, that's kind of the purpose. As you get to the space between the lower 7 and the upper 3, then you're dealing with getting back to the idea of knowing God ultimately and going back to the original state of creation. And actually, we're going to get to that in just a minute. But from a Jewish perspective, you never really go to those upper 3. You go to Tiferet, or splendor, beauty.
You get good at path working, you can go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But you just go to the other 3 in like 15 minutes, just walking like you're walking through this building.
It's sort of something where, in order to, you could try to go through quickly in all of them without any like significant time or effort, but there's, on the one hand, the question of how much are you going to get from that experience and how much are you going to be changed by it. On the other hand, how ready are you going to be for the things that you experience at those levels, and are you going to be able to interpret and understand them? So in Jewish Kabbalah, there's sort of an idea that there's nothing beyond Tiferet that man can really understand or experience. Tiferet brings us closest back to that original state of Eden, and that's all we ever really need. In the Lurianic interpretation, Tiferet brings us into the Messianic age, and the world is therefore reunited with the divine, and that's really all we need. In the Golden Dawn system, there's kind of a view that you can get to Gevurah and Hesed, and you can experience the full balance of those 7 spheres that are understandable in the knowable world, but there's no point where you jump across into the upper 3, simply because they are incomprehensible to man. The AA system, however, does embrace the idea that you can reach those upper 3 and gain initiation into them. And even from the perspective of not necessarily moving up into those higher spheres, there's still the idea that there are things you can know and understand and experience from them, even if you're not seating your being within them. So because we're going to touch a little bit more on that idea in just a minute, I'm going to go through the second form of creation, because it sets up one of the more interesting Kabbalistic ideas. In the Lurianic view of creation, instead of simply looking at it as God unfolds the tree and that creates the universe, and then man falls because of eating the fruit, God makes a tree and fails to make the tree properly, which kind of begs the question of, can God really fail? But his first tree, instead of the sphere of Gevurah, or judgment, there's the sphere of din, or evil. and instead of mercy, there's glory, or Gedulah. So the original tree, the light passes through the first 3 spheres, enters into glory, enters into evil, and then passes on to the rest of the tree. Each sphere beneath any given sphere contains the nature of the previous sphere within it. And so all the spheres after Din contain within them evil or a flaw. And so when the divine light is entered into the tree after it's built, Din and the subsequent spheres shatter and fall off from the tree, carrying with them pieces of the divine light. God then makes a new tree and replaces Gedulah with Chesed and Din with Gevurah as more refined versions of those concepts. And so the spheres on the new tree don't have the same imperfection, and they're able to receive the light and create the world. So in a sense, though, even though the second tree works, it's incomplete, because there's elements of divine light that broke off with those spheres and fell beneath the world and scattered throughout the world in places where they weren't intended to be. This sets up the idea of the problem of evil within the Kabbalah and within Judaic thinking. In the modern approach to the Kabbalah, this is explained with the Qliphoth, which are treated as an avarice tree, or a tree that exists below the tree of life, and is the realm of demons. It's a series of hells that exist, and that you would move through this tree in order to explore these demonic realms and these demonic ideals, or you would move through this tree in order to bind and kind of reintegrate the fallen pieces of yourself and improve your psychological state. None of this has anything to do with Kabbalah in a Jewish sense. This is all stuff that the Golden Dawn and later people made up, mostly Kenneth Grant. And it's, in my view, sort of nonsensical and kind of worthless. In the traditional Kabbalah, evil has to do with the evil impulse, which could be understood as covetousness, which is the basis of the evil eye, the idea of looking at something with jealousy, desiring something, wishing ill upon something, because it's something that you wish that you don't have. It's also the idea of wanting to undo or uncreate things in the universe because they're not things that you have, or they're not things that you want. And so it's a force that's set against creation. In the traditional Kabbalah, this is described as the Sitra Acher, or the other tree. And instead of being a tree beneath the tree made from this flawed first creation, it's basically, if you stand looking at the tree and then you walk around and look at it from the other side, you're looking at the Sitra Acher. You're looking at the evil tree on the other side. And it's identical to the tree of life.
It has a mustache.
Yes. And
Evil mustache.
that mustache is the force of the evil impulse moving through the tree instead of the force of divine light moving through the tree.
This is, Paul, does that have any connection to, you're talking about the evil spirits? Does that have any connection to like binding the lesser internals? Or
in modern Hermetic Kabbalah, it does. In traditional Kabbalah, there's no real space for evil spirits. So,
well, I was trying to tie it back to like this, like Solomonic.
Yep, and a lot of people do that. A lot of people look at the demons in the grimoires as being the spirits of the Qliphoth. Some people will describe the demons as goetic spirits because they're listed in the Goetia of Solomon. Goetia just means sorcery. It's not a type of spirit.
Well, no, but they're the same spirits listed there.
Oddly, the Golden Dawn doesn't use all those spirits for their spirits that it links to the Qliphoth. I'm not sure what Kenneth Grant does, but yes, people that are trying to work that approach of making the Qliphoth tie to the
I haven't
spirits,
studied the
link them together.
Because I've studied like the lesser thought or
Yeah.
something. I wondered what the connection was.
There's
The
no
people-
connection.
Okay,
It's
so
yeah.
it's just-
It's they're two unrelated things. That's actually a note that I have a couple lines later, is that the two don't connect to each other, even though people sometimes want them
that's
to.
good know.
And so, but in the Sitra Achar, instead of having demons, you would basically have the angels that you would have in the regular tree of life, but instead of doing something productive or creative, they're doing something destructive. So, for instance, if you work with Samael as the angel of Mars, working from the perspective of the tree of life, then Samael is going to help you with resolving conflict or having the strength to succeed in a conflict. If you work with Samael from the perspective of the tree of evil, then Samael is going to help you create conflict and tear down structures and destroy harmony. So they're the same force, they're the same idea, but it's how they're acting. It's one is the virtue, one is the vice. That's all the tree of evil is in traditional Kabbalah. The Qliphoth is different from the tree of evil because the Qliphoth are not a tree at all. Again, in the Golden Dawn system, they map them to a tree, but I think it's much easier to think of them almost like a marsh or a swamp. The Qliphoth are the actual broken shards of the original Sephirot, and those shards fall within the world. So when you encounter something that is negative or that's not the way it's supposed to be, something that is fighting against its purpose in creation in the world, you're encountering a Qliphoth or Qlipah. And your job as a mystic or as a magician is to resolve that Qlipah and release the potential for goodness, the potential for light and order from that shell, so that that light can return back to the tree and help repair the world. In Judaism, this is called Tikkun Olam, or the reparation of the world. And it's again an idea that affirms that man participates in creation. It's the soteriological element of the Kabbalah, that the world has its flaws, it has its problems, but because man is in the image of the Creator, and man is essentially a creator deity, just like God, man is able to go forth and fix those problems and make the world better. The thing that gets...
2 minutes.
Okay. The thing
I
that...
know you'll probably go over, I don't care, but
Okay. The thing that gets difficult with that is that those husks don't just fall into the world, they fall beneath the world itself. And that's where the Golden Dawn builds its model of a tree of evil underneath Malchut. But again, where I would say an easier way to look at it is if underneath creation there's just the darkness that's left over where God did not shine light. And those husks fall into that darkness, which is like a quagmire of mud and tar and gunk. And so in order to fully repair the world, at some point people have to descend down into that darkness and find those shells and engage them and release the light from that darkness. Now that...
Aren't we already as individuals like that?
That's the part of the shells that are in the world. But the idea in Isaac Luria's Kabbalah was that those who are spiritually fit enough can go even deeper beneath the world to confront deeper darkness and try to heal the world that way. Now that can tie back to stuff that Eliphas Levi wrote about working with the demons of the Grimoire system, and which is implied a little bit in the Book of Oberon and in a couple other sources, that the magician, by working with these spirits, is able to help redeem them and restore them back to their original space at the beginning of creation before the fall. And that by working for the magician prays for the demons, the magician speaks for the demons at the judgment. The magician gives the demons an opportunity to work within the realm of creation in order to participate in bettering the world, so that in the final judgment they can then be restored again back to their original place instead of destroyed. That's the closest you really get to the Qliphoth connecting in with the demons, is just the sense that the world is messed up sometimes, and it's up to people as extensions of the Creator to fix how the world is messed up, which then kind of answers the question of how does God fail at making the tree? God doesn't fail at making the tree. God fucks the tree up on purpose so that man can then go forth and help make the tree better.
So that's how we get ends.
Yes.
So you're saying God's a jerk.
God's hopeful.
Smarter than us all.
God's a jerk. He's making work for us.
Expert system.
So the moving off of the Qliphoth, which are sometimes described as an abyss, we get to the concept of the abyss. So you kind of have in modern Kabbalah this idea of an abyss below the tree, which is where the Qliphoth are, and then there's the abyss within the tree, which is the sphere of Da'at, or knowledge. In traditional Kabbalah, Da'at is a placeholder, Sephirah. It's this idea that Keter is way too awesome to be part of the tree. It's too much like God, and so we can't define God as a sphere. So we've got to take Keter out and say it's part of the veils of creation. But there still needs to be another sphere. So, all right, we'll put Dot in there. And that explains how we can have a 10th sphere. Some modern Kabbalists describe Da'at as the space left over by Malchut falling from the tree. And in that view, it kind of looks at Malchut sitting as centered between the supernal and the ethical triads, as opposed to being linked with Yesod at the bottom. I don't know if that's your traditional idea outside of Hermetic Kabbalah, but it could reasonably work and fits with the mythology. In Jewish Kabbalah, Da'at's not super important because, again, you don't go to anything beyond Tiferet. Tiferet is allowing you to enter into the space of Eden. It's allowing you to enter into the space of the Messianic age. There's no real reason to look at anything beyond Tiferet in Jewish Kabbalah. Again, the Golden Dawn Kabbalah doesn't really look much beyond Chesed and Gevurah. So, in fact, modern Golden Dawn Kabbalists say that everything happens in Malchut. That there's no point where you leave Malchut. None of the initiations play out above Malchut. Everything is happening within the kingdom because everything is happening in the material world. That is something that I think Chris Monastra said when they were publishing Regardi's Golden Dawn, and it's something people kind of stuck with. Nothing in the original Golden Dawn literature, nothing in the AA's approach to the Golden Dawn system, or anything in anything before Regardi published the Golden Dawn suggests that idea. In all earlier versions of the Golden Dawn work, you actually do move through the tree. But the Golden Dawn just stops at Chesed. The AA, however, says you go all the way up through to Keter. And so Da'at becomes a super important concept in Thelema, even though it wasn't necessarily an important concept in other Kabbalah before. The basic idea is that the exempt adept has mastered everything related to the lower 7 spheres of the tree. The exempt adept has mastered all magic, has mastered all knowledge of the mysteries, has gained all of the special visions that are associated with the tree and the paths, and brings them all together and is like, I am freaking awesome. I'm the master of all magic. I can either decide to be the master of all magic and assert my dominance over the world and become a brother of the Black Lodge, or I can be awesome and jump across this crazy abyss, fight a monster, bleed out into a cup held by a sacred whore, and become one with divinity. So that's basically the proposition of the abyss in Thelema. The exempt adept is skilled enough that they can come to the abyss, they can crystallize their knowledge of everything they've experienced, and they can enter into the abyss and sacrifice everything. Pour out every last drop of their blood into the cup of Babylon and give up everything that they know and understand as themselves, even giving up their holy guardian angel, which outside of Thelema probably doesn't look like a big deal to anyone. It wouldn't have been significant in most magic prior to the Golden Dawn, outside of like people working the Abramelin system. But from a thelemic perspective, knowledge and conversation with your holy guardian angel is pretty much your crowning achievement up to that point in the AA system. It's what made you an adept. It's what sets you up to be able to become an exempt adept and reach the border of the abyss. It's literally the point of initiation at the center of the tree. And up to that point, it's been your personal awareness of divinity. Maybe it's your higher self, maybe it's not. Yes?
So you say there's a way to actually go and talk to your guardian angel, like we're talking, get advice on all kind of whatever. It's like how to run that job. No, it's be my lover.
Yeah, like it's not necessarily the same as sitting down face to face with a person and talking to them, but it is much closer to that than most other experiences of talking to spirits tend to be. The holy guardian angel, when you receive knowledge and conversation, sort of becomes like a possessing spirit. It's there in communion and in communication with you on a basis where you don't necessarily have to reach out and go through some ritual in order to contact it. It's there ready to speak to you and give insight when it chooses to or when you ask for it.
Like in an emergency.
Yeah, so it could present itself as giving added insight in an emergency. It could also interpret other spiritual experiences for you. So it's something where you have a very intimate connection. So the idea of giving that up becomes a pretty major thing when you're working from a religious or magical system where that's been so central. Again, you give up every drop of your blood to the cup of Babylon. So there's nothing left that vivifies you or holds you together, and you become a pile of ash in the city of the pyramids. You enter into the space where there is no more separation and everything is right there with the divine. Honestly, this sounds way more Buddhist than it does Kabbalistic, or really tying into anything else in the Western mystery tradition before it. The closest thing you would have is probably the beatific vision that occurs in traditional Christianity, and which we see in the Sworn Book of Honorius as a magical text. But in the Sworn Book of Honorius, you're getting the beatific vision so that you see God, and then the angels get to know you as someone who's seen God and is cool with God, and so the angels let you call them and do stuff for you. So the beatific vision in Honorius is a lot more like Abramelin than it is like crossing the abyss. The closest thing to it is probably when Enoch sees God and becomes the Metatron. Because the idea here is that you're being stripped away of everything that made you individually you, and you're uniting with God in a way that refines your you-ness back to its original divine nature.
So this is like merging with the all and becoming deified.
Yes.
Crucifixion of ego.
Right.
Yeah. It's also the point that relates to the unification of opposition. In Tiferet, you're balancing opposition, and so the adept can balance things. The master, however, sees no opposition. Essentially, you're taking a position where you have the ultimate concept of duality. There's you over here and the world over here, and there's God over here. And you're saying, I'm going to enter into that space between the world and God so that there's no more space for me, and so that I no longer comprehend the existence of this space, so that everything is now one, and there's no longer any sort of opposition. So even within the idea of things that you experience in the world that are opposites, you understand those things then as a continuum and things that essentially have a sameness to them. You're eliminating the I-thou perspective from human experience, which again still sounds a lot like Buddhism. You're taking away the idea of opposition, so there's no longer a thing to look at and desire, so there's no suffering because you no longer are desiring anything. You have simply allowed yourself to be sublimated out into everything else that is, so that you and divinity are the same existence. In the AA system, this is the space of the Magister and of the Magus. The Magister relates to Binah and the reception, and the Magus relates to Chokmah and projection. And so you have the idea of projecting out divinity, projecting out wisdom, and receiving divinity and creating understanding all within one space. They're separate grades, but pretty much anyone that experiences them describes the grades of Magister through Ipsissimus, really Magister through Magus, and somewhat with Exempt Adept as a continuum where you're constantly operating between those three spaces. But you essentially take the whole model of creation of the tree and compress it into these two roles. It becomes sort of the ultimate expression of what sex magic is. The idea of taking two things, the expression and the reception of a thing, and merging them into one being so that that single being is able to engage in both the masculine and the feminine end of creation. And ironically, while the Magister is the hermit in the tarot cards, and this is the sort of the order of the hermit in the AA structure, it's in a sense the most social grade of the AA, because in all the other grades of the AA, you're working by yourself, you're working with your teacher, you're working with your student. The Magister and the Magus are about communicating out to large groups of people and working with society or mankind as a whole. So it's the most individuated space that is also the most social space at the same time. So even just the nature of the grade is mitigating opposition. From a Kabbalistic perspective, if we're looking at Da'at within the story of creation, man eats from the tree of knowledge and is expelled from the garden. Da'at is knowledge. Knowledge is the concept of a binary. It's the concept of having a knower and a known. And without that division of opposition, there's no need for knowledge because there's just experience. Man directly experiences God in paradise, and then once he has knowledge, is expelled from paradise and has to look back towards God in order to experience him from afar. When we describe what happens with the process of traversing Da'at, then we're looking at pouring ourselves out into the cup of Babylon. And so we're taking this idea that everything that we have experienced up to that point, all the knowledge that we've condensed, all the experience we've condensed from our journey up the tree, everything we've done to become an exempt adept at that point, we're taking it and crystallizing it into a single thing where all knowledge is therefore united back together into a single whole and given forth back to the universe. So essentially we're taking the fruit that Adam ate and we're giving that fruit back so that we no longer have to know the universe from the perspective of a knower or the perspective of someone who has knowledge of the universe. We simply experience the universe from the perspective of the universe itself at that point. In looking at Da'at that way, Da'at kind of stops being a sphere on the tree. And I think that it's almost more tenable to think of Da'at like a breath or a space, as opposed to a letter or an expression. That Da'at is the clouds or the fog that obscure the unity of everything. And from one perspective, light travels through that fog and is divided out into infinity and into a multitude of different knowable things that are able to experience and know each other. Going the other direction, that infinite series of manifestations brings itself back together through that same cloud and becomes that unified light again, returning back to its original state of creation. And that is pretty much where I wanted to leave off. I was going to talk a little bit about the speaking silence, which is the heart of God, as another way of looking at this idea of mitigated opposition, but I don't think it's going to really... It could.
He did promise us a part 2. We just don't know when it's going to be scheduled just yet.
Yes, and the idea, part 2 will be taking sort of the practical element of things and how you take these Kabbalistic ideas and build practical, magical operations and practical mystical processes from them.
That's going to include conjuring a piece, right?
Yes.
Yes,
That would
conjuring a
make some
piece.
of our events much easier.
Yes.
What? I already picture a piece. What's your fucking
So, were there any further questions anyone had, either about Da'at or the Abyss, which again, not really super traditional Kabbalah, that's very much a Hermetic Kabbalah thing, or just the Kabbalah in general and the underlying ideas of it?
Let me get it straight. So you're saying, is this like the Martinist thing where you go into the all and then reintegrate?
That sounds similar. I'm not a Martinist, so I can't say for sure. But yeah, I mean, it's basically the idea, again, like in Buddhism, you sublimate out into the universe, but a bodhisattva continues their interaction with the universe, expressing that unity out. Another way to think of it is like being a force ghost. Obi-Wan disperses out into all of creation, but when he needs to help out Luke, he can manifest and show up.
That
So,
sounds right.
yeah.
And
So-
we bring it back to Star Wars.
To be fair, it's from the same source.
Yeah.
Well, yes.
I mean, the whole Force Ghost concept
Yes.
is on Buddhism, and I would say that Martinism is another thing like Theosophy, which is heavily Eastern influenced and represents a major importation of Eastern philosophy into Western occultism.
So that's,
Yeah.
yeah.
I'd say there's actually a pretty
it's-
straight line there.
Yeah, probably very
That's
much.
kind of what it sounded like.
Another
Yeah.
way to look at that is, people talk about prayer, and it's like, okay, if God has this plan and God exists, why the hell does God care if people pray for things? God doesn't care about anything. God is the totality of creation. But miracles or magic are essentially the focusing of a particular force within the universe and causing it to come to bear in a particular situation. Not exactly a deist. I don't think God went away. I think God is everywhere. So if you have a particular movement in God, you take the idea that something which is the unmanifest totality momentarily coalesces itself into a particular nature at a particular point. And that is essentially the nature of the miraculous. So it's the same idea that if you are a master who is sublimated out into the universe and you continue out trying to make the manifest universe understand where it's supposed to go, you are functioning as that unmanifest totality manifesting intentionally in a particular way. If you are Obi-Wan, you're that unmanifest totality manifesting a particular way to create a particular moment. The same thing when something miraculous happens, which is a little converse from my usual explanation of we can all be miracles. But from an alternate idea, you yourself are a particular manifestation of divinity happening at a particular moment in a particular way to create a particular thing. And so the more you come to understand and the more you sort of unfold yourself back through creation to create that larger perspective, the more you can direct the way in which you're manifesting back into the universe, and therefore kind of become that miraculous thing of repairing the world, which from the very little bit I'm aware of Martinism, I would assume is kind of tied into their same
It just
idea.
kind of sounded similar
Yeah.
to what I've read. Okay.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, didn't